Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Michael Schnell, congressional reporter at The Hill. Thank you all for joining us today for a deep dive into The Hill Talks breaking down financial barriers to clinical trial participation. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Eli Lilly, for their support of this discussion. Now, most of us are familiar with the concept of clinical trials, may even have a family member or a friend who's taken part in one. These studies are important for researching potential new cures and treatments for diseases, and many provide participants with earlier access to potential new medicines. However, there are large segments of the U.S. population, particularly those in rural areas or with limited incomes, who have been excluded from clinical trials. For these patients, the financial burden of participation may simply be too high, with lost wages, time, and out-of-pocket costs for transportation and lodging. So what can Congress do to make clinical trials more accessible to patients? What are the biggest barriers to participation? And what does this all mean for the future of drug development? Today, we'll examine these questions and more. Now, before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. Please join the conversation on social media. You can find us on Facebook, X, and Instagram at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillHealth. And my first guest is Dr. Larry Bucshon. He's a senior policy advisor at Holland and Knight and a former congressman from Indiana. He's advocated for patient-centered healthcare reforms that support innovation and give patients access to high-quality, affordable, and timely care, while also ensuring that patients and their doctors have the freedom to make their own healthcare decisions. Dr. Bucshon, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start here. You have been focusing on this issue while you were in Congress, also with your background as a physician. What changes in your eyes need to be made to help improve clinical trial participation among some underrepresented communities?
Well, there's a number of them. And as you probably know, in the last Congress, Dr. Ruiz and I had H.R. 8412, which would modernize clinical trials for a variety of reasons. There's financial barriers involved, transportation to and from, housing, and other things that limits participation. Some of the other things are just physical location. You have people in rural communities that don't have access to academic medical centers, so they can't participate. So you need to consider things like remote participation. And, a lot of underrepresented groups haven't historically been just recruited, right, for these programs. And most of it has ended up having populations in clinical trials that don't represent what America looks like today. So, there's a lot of things going on here, but one of the main issue, I think, is financial support for participants. They just can't afford to participate in a clinical trial for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, this is something I wanted to dive into, and we're going to get to it from a lot of different aspects. But I was so taken aback by the statistic that I learned that there are only 5% of the population participates in these clinical trials. What do you think is leading and result? Why is that number so low? What is leading to that number being such a staggeringly low number of just 5%?
Well, for some, they just don't realize that these things are out there. A lot of people will participate. For example, if they get cancer and they realize that they are at the end of their line as far as traditional treatment, and they start looking for clinical trial availability. But prior to that, they're just not aware that these things are out there. And I don't think overall, we've done a good job recruiting diverse populations of people over the years. And then honestly, there are populations sometimes that just feel like, they don't want to be a quote unquote guinea pig, right? They don't have confidence in the system, so they won't participate even if you ask them. So there's just a multitude of reasons. I think a lot of it, though, like I said, comes back to financial incentives and financial barriers. But a lot of it has to do with the fact people just aren't aware these things are out there unless, like I said, unless they have a medical condition, then they start looking around.
Are any patients penalized financially for participating in these trials? Do they have to put up money to participate, or is it more so that folks who are just exposed to this more and more resources are able to participate? What exactly is the financial and economic foundation of leading to this problem?
Yeah, I would say generally no. People don't have to pay to participate, but there are substantial costs. Say, for example, you live 200 miles away from an academic medical center, and a lot of financial support just isn't there for transportation, housing, and all of those things. So unless you're, like I said, unless you it's directly affecting you, like you're a cancer patient or something that needs to be involved, the financial barriers prevent people from voluntarily saying, well, I want to participate in this to see, how I can help future generations with medical issues because they just can't afford to do it. So in general, I think it's that. It's not the fact that they actually have to necessarily pay the researchers directly to participate, but all these other outside costs are the barrier.
Sure. And then before you were in Congress, you were a physician, surgeon, full time. I guess first I'm going to
Yes.
ask: Are you still at that? Or do you still work in medicine? And then, have you seen this yeah, front row, firsthand? Have you worked in any of these clinical trials and sort of seen any of these issues up close?
Yeah, no, I haven't practiced medicine since I got elected to Congress. You really can't. I was a cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon, so you can't do that even part-time. And yes, during my medical training, during residency, we had all kinds of mostly clinical trials going on, not laboratory type, but like, for example, patients came in with certain infections to our surgery department, and we had trials going on testing different effectiveness of different antibiotic therapy, for example, and we would offer patients, on site participation in these studies, and a large percentage of people, number one, weren't aware of them, and number two, were reluctant because, again, they felt like, well, I'm not wanting to be a so-called guinea pig in this study. I want my infection cured, right, or my disease cured with standard therapy. So yeah, I saw it directly. We had a difficulty, and sometimes takes months or years to get enough people into a clinical trial that the results of the trial will be statistically significant that gives you a result. So yeah, I saw it directly during my residency training when we were trying to get people involved.
And then let's sort of dive into, I think, a question in a lot of folks' mind. What can Congress do about this? I know that you had some legislation that you worked on when you were in Congress. We're going to
Yes.
dive into that after. But just first, like 30,000 foot view, what capacity does Congress have to help improve these problems that we're laying out here with clinical trials?
Well, I mean, I think they'll need to allow researchers to use some of the research dollars to financially support participants in certain studies. And again, Dr. Ruiz and I had legislation last Congress. It was 8412, and your viewers can Google that and see what that did. But it did take down some financial barriers, and it added some grant money in there for specifically offsetting costs like transportation, housing, and other indirect costs for patients to participate. So I think from a federal government standpoint, that you can include grant programs that allow researchers to recruit people from rural areas, from underserved urban areas, and support them financially through federal grants. And I think that's one of the approaches. That was one of the barriers to getting the bill across the finish line because you know that right now, as you see, the federal government budget is very tight and things are actually being cut rather than added. But I think that's where Congress could go, grants to support these type of costs for people to participate.
And then let's dive into the Clinical Trial Modernization Act. I know that you co-led that, as you mentioned, with Congressman Ruiz.
Yeah.
Explain to me, what exactly would this bill do? What are sort of the key tenets of it?
Well, it did a number of things that I've talked about. It helped remove economic barriers by creating grant programs, but it also allowed, in some instances, for participation remotely in clinical trials. It depends on what the trial is, right? If you're doing a clinical trial based on, um, psychiatric issues or things, you can do those remotely. And, it also used some of the grant money to help public relations to help recruit people from underserved populations, like, our inner city populations, our rural Americans that may or may not be aware that there's studies available out there. And so, also it wanted to make sure that, say, for example, you get a grant and you're supported financially for your travel and your um, housing, that you didn't get taxed on that wasn't considered taxable income. So you have to look at that on the back end also. So it did all of those things, but primarily create grants to help offset financial costs, but then also potentially create a system where people can participate remotely in clinical trials.
The bill was introduced in the last Congress. It didn't get a vote, despite it having this bipartisan backing. Are there plans for Congressman Ruiz or somebody else to reintroduce it this Congress? Do you know? And do you think it has a chance of potentially getting a vote on the House or in the Senate, and progressing to maybe one day make it on the president's desk?
Yeah, I think they are going to reintroduce it. I've heard recently that we're there, Dr. Ruiz is gonna have a Republican co-sponsor of this legislation. One of the barriers also, and I didn't mention to this, was of course the whole situation, honestly, surrounding DEI and whether or not, this constituted another form of that, which in healthcare it does not. It kind of got confounded in there. We actually changed the name of this legislation from diversification of clinical trials to modernization for that reason. So I think, some of that narrative is softening and people are realizing, look, in medicine, having diverse populations participate in clinical trials is critical because, certain groups of people will go, well, yeah, I mean, I could take that medicine, but the clinical trial didn't have anybody, didn't have any women in the study or something, or didn't have any African American people in the study. And people will be reluctant to accept those results for themselves personally, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity for this to ultimately make it into law because it just makes common sense, right? We do have to get back past the budgetary issue with a grant program, and I can't recall exactly what it was. I think it was like maybe $20 million over 10 years. It was a small amount of money, but we have to get past that. But I'm optimistic because people more and more are realizing how important this is. When you had the vaccine trials, for example, for COVID, some of the resistance in rural America and amongst African Americans was the fact that they didn't have confidence in the clinical trials and whether or not it was safe to take the vaccine. And there was some history there where it takes many years to get vaccines produced. They were leery about the short-term nature of producing the vaccine, even though it was, in my view, a transformational process. People just didn't have confidence in it. So, I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful. And I think ultimately this type of thing will become law. When, I don't know.
Another aspect that we're going to be discussing a lot throughout all these conversations as part of this event is there's the economic barriers that come with these clinical trials, but also there's the diversity aspect, and I think you kind of alluded it to. And of course, it could be economic diversity, but it could also be racial diversity. How is that played out into these clinical trials? Is that an aspect where these clinical trials participation could improve in terms of having a more diverse population of folks take part? And what are some of the barriers there?
Well, absolutely. That's the whole intent of what Dr. Ruiz and I were trying to do, right? Is create a population of people involved in clinical trials that looks more like the population of America, right? Because that creates confidence in the system. And when you have low participation in whatever study it is for certain groups, whether it's ethnic, racial, or whether it's men, women, children, adults, and you don't have that type of diversity, people won't have confidence in the results. Not the scientists, the citizens. And I totally understand that. So, it's critical. And a lot of the participation barriers are geographic. Like I said, people in rural America that I represented, I mean, they really couldn't go, 200 miles away and participate in these clinical trials just out of the goodness of their heart. Not that they didn't want to, but then they had these financial barriers. They have to buy gas to travel there. They have to stay in a hotel. They can't do that. And they may have to make multiple trips and take time off work. That's the other thing we didn't mention is, the time commitment in some clinical trials is substantial, and people that have to work and can't take time off. So those are the barriers. I mean, I think, researchers at large, for the most part, are trying to recruit a more diverse population of people, but there are these barriers that we've mentioned that are stymieing that effort.
Congressman, I have one more question for you. We're running out of time here. Fascinating conversation. What gives you hope right now about the improvements that could be made in the clinical trial space? And you've been away from Capitol Hill for a little bit, so perhaps you're a little bit more optimistic than some of your former colleagues who tend to have more of a pessimistic attitude when you're up on Capitol Hill, where there's a lot going on under the dome. But curious to know, what gives you hope about this current area right now of how things could improve?
Well, I think coming out of COVID, I think people realize that it's necessary, right? I mean, we saw again with COVID what happened. We in rural America, I had a bunch of people that wouldn't take the vaccine. I'm for a variety of reasons, and it wasn't just political. Some of them just didn't have confidence in the process because they didn't understand it. They weren't allowed. The people that were in the study weren't from rural America, and then you had other populations of people. Initially, the African American population in the cities that were reluctant because of historical studies, the Tuskegee experiments and stuff, but that the federal government did many years ago, but also the fact that the studies on the vaccine didn't include many of them because they either weren't asked to participate or they couldn't afford it. So that's why I think coming out of COVID, people now recognize the importance of this issue, whereas before COVID, maybe people did not.
All right, Dr. Larry Bucshon, former congressman from Indiana and the senior policy advisor at Holland and Knight. We have to end it there, but really interesting insights. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. We appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure.
Next, we're going to hear a word from our sponsor, Eli Lilly. Please welcome my colleague and friend, Sarashi Rai, Director of Audience Development at The Hill. She's joined in conversation with Jeffrey Francer, Vice President of Global Regulatory Policy and Strategy at Eli Lilly. Sarashi?
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Jeff, for joining us today to discuss this important topic. Glad to have you with us here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, clinical trials allow patients to access potential cutting-edge therapies sooner than they otherwise would have been able to. But there are a number of financial barriers that continue to prevent and restrict participation. Can you shine a light on some of these barriers?
Sure. For far too long, it's been very difficult for patients in rural areas or low-income patients to participate in clinical trials. It's expensive to take time off from work. It's expensive sometimes to get to a clinical trial site. So one thing that we can do is to try to make it easier for patients who want to participate in cutting-edge research, and we can make it easier for them by providing financial assistance. But sometimes our laws and our regulations make it difficult to do that.
Yeah, and digging a little deeper, can you walk us through how this would unfold from the patient's perspective?
Yeah. So imagine you're a patient. You may live 50 or 100 miles from an academic medical center and you want to participate in a clinical trial. You might have a chronic disease. You might be in a wheelchair, and you might have a relative who has to help you. So all of this is quite expensive, and it might be possible for the sponsor of the trial to provide a stipend or to provide transportation for you to participate. But unfortunately, that money might actually be taxable if you were to accept that assistance. It might even impact your ability to get supplemental assistance from the government. So in a way, providing this type of assistance could actually disadvantage someone who needs medical help and could participate in cutting-edge research. And we think that this is a policy that really should be changed.
And so why is Lilly so passionate about this issue of eliminating financial barriers to clinical trial participation? How does this align with the company's broader work to reshape the clinical trial environment on behalf of patients?
Yeah, well, our mission is pretty simple. We take science and we try to make patients' lives better. And we do a lot of work in chronic diseases such as diabetes, eliminating obesity, Alzheimer's disease. And this work is very difficult, but it's also very difficult for patients and it's difficult for researchers. One of the things that we can do in order to improve research and in order to improve the lives of patients is to make it easier to conduct clinical research. Unfortunately, a lot of our clinical trial rules and regulations stem from a time when much of the research was conducted in big city hospitals. That's no longer the case. and our rules have to adapt so that we can improve the lives of patients and also improve research.
Yeah, that's right. And what can Congress do to eliminate some of these financial barriers to bring Lilly's vision to life?
Yeah, well, there has been legislation introduced, the Clinical Trial Modernization Act and the Harley-Jacobson Act, which would do a few things. Number one, it would make it such that the assistance that a patient might get for participating in a clinical trial isn't considered taxable income, so it doesn't disadvantage the patient. Number two is it could provide a safe harbor for researchers to be able to provide this assistance, because right now there's some vagaries in the law there. And number three, we could make it such that providing this type of assistance wouldn't eliminate eligibility for receiving supplemental income. So these are just really basic bipartisan things that Congress can do to try to make it easier for patients around the country to participate in clinical research.
And if these barriers are not addressed, what does the future of clinical trials look like?
Well, we're going to keep fighting for patients, and we hope that these things are addressed. But aside from working to make things easier for patients, we're going to do everything we can. We also want to try to look at the regulations that are behind the governance of clinical trials. We want to make it easier for researchers to participate, not just in big city hospitals, but around the country. So we're going to keep fighting for patients, and hopefully Congress can help us out.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. And that's our time. Thank you again to Jeff and to Eli Lilly for their support of today's program. Back to you, Michael.
All right, thanks so much to Sarashi and Jeff, and thank you again to our sponsor today, Eli Lilly, for their support for the program. I now want to bring in Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan. She's a Democrat from Pennsylvania and the co-sponsor of the Harley-Jacobson Clinical Trial Participation Income Exemption Act. Welcome, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Congresswoman, let's dive right in. What do you see as some of the biggest hurdles to participation in some of these clinical trials?
Sure. I think that what's important is in this environment, this political environment that we're in, we're seeing a decreasing amount of federal funding for trials in general, right? Before that was an issue, we still had an issue with whether or not we could find people to participate in those trials and to make sure that those people were diverse in their backgrounds, because science does actually differentiate and discriminate between people based on their DNA and their genetics. And so we need to make sure in our trials that we have a diverse group of people to participate. And sometimes there are socioeconomic barriers to people being able to participate. And one of those is that even if people are being paid for their participation in a clinical trial, the current law is that they are taxed for that income. And in many cases, that taxation on that income brings them to a taxation level that makes them unqualified for certain other benefits like SNAP benefits. And so as a consequence, you end up with a group of people in your study who aren't reflective of the body, the entire population itself.
And let me ask, what can Congress do here? What role do you think Congress can play? I know that there have been a number of pieces of legislation about this. We're going to dive into some specifics about that in just a little bit. But sort of 30,000-foot view, what exactly do you see as Congress's role here?
First of all, Congress can recognize that this is an issue and recognize that it's important to be able to, number one, fund things like this kind of research. And we can have a very long conversation about what's going on in the administration right now in defunding those kinds of research efforts. But putting that to the side, recognizing that we need to make sure that these studies are diverse and represent the entire population, we can help by making this go away, making this issue go away so that we don't tax the income that people get, which is modest to begin with when they participate in a study like this.
Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about one of the specific bills you've sponsored. I mentioned it in the introduction, the Harley-Jacobson Clinical Trial Participation Income Exemption Act. It would essentially exempt all payments received by participants in clinical trials from being counted towards their gross income. Talk to me why this is such an important part of this greater problem that we're discussing today.
Sure. And Harley-Jacobson was a member of my community. He had ALS and succumbed to that very, very horrible disease. And he is a person who exemplifies the problem here. He could have participated in some trials that may have saved his life or helped others in the process, but because of income issues, may have not been able to participate in them because he would have lost benefits. And so this piece of legislation does exactly what we're talking about, which is saying that for the modest and meager amount of money that people do receive for participating in clinical trials, that is not taxable income. It also makes it so that the people who are performing the trials don't have to go through the process of reporting on that income, and that is in and of itself something that is a barrier for companies, because it's, as you can imagine, pretty complicated to find people to participate, to then file all of the different taxes on both sides that are required. And so this is hopefully going to unjam the pipeline for the companies who are creating these kinds of trials and allow people to be able to better participate. And also, there is apparently a problem where people drop out as they recognize these issues as well. And science is really, really destroyed when we end up with inconsistent data.
Mm-hmm. And your legislation actually eliminates the reporting requirements for both the patient and the caregiver. Explain why that's so important.
Sure. And again, I think that this is a bipartisan piece of legislation. It was introduced by Representative Thompson and myself, both of us from Pennsylvania. And I share the anxiety that many of my Republican colleagues have, that sometimes enough is enough and too much is too much in terms of reporting requirements. And so by lowering barriers or eliminating barriers, or eliminating barriers to this, we end up having the more likelihood that people will participate. And I want to correct myself. It was Representative Mike Kelly from our delegation that I am co-sponsoring this with.
So I was doing research here, and one of the statistics that really caught my attention was that only 5% of Americans actually participate in clinical trials. It's such a low number for such important trials that happen. What more needs to be done to increase that number?
That I can't necessarily comment on. I'm thinking through why that would be. I know I have a friend, a very dear friend, who is in the process of going through a number of trials, and it is quite hard to, first of all, find them, and second of all, be eligible for them. So there may be a larger issue of having a clearinghouse of availability, and there is certainly the larger problem that we started the conversation with, which is we need to have basic research in clinical trials in order for the common good to advance and the common health to advance. There was recently an article that I read yesterday about a baby who was literally cured of his very, very rare genetic disease because of CRISPR technology, and a trial that he was able to participate in. And that is generations of research building upon the ability to save a child's life. And that's why this kind of research is so important.
And you've urged the National Institute of Health, the NIH, to reverse research funding cuts. How does this play into this greater problem of the problems associated with clinical trials?
Well, as you've seen, there's been, I think, what can only be described as draconian cuts to the NIH, and the NIH itself is, I think, in peril of continuing to exist as we know it. And so this would certainly, we have asked separately that we make sure that we roll back those cuts, and I'm hoping that that will happen. At risk of sounding terribly political, I think that President Trump is behaving at this point in time as the arsonist and then the firefighter. He burns things down and then builds them back up. I'm certainly hopeful that we can build back up the importance of the NIH, and I've heard whispers of that from my Republican colleagues. But we don't have time. When we drop research midstream, when we stop recruiting candidates for research, as many researchers are doing right now, when we lose researchers to other countries, which is happening as well, when there's a brain drain, when this kind of thing happens, we as a nation become weaker, literally and physically weaker.
And how exactly can we empower U.S. innovation here while also eliminating financial barriers so more patients can participate in clinical trials? Can those two things happen at once?
I think that they are complementary. I think that we need to have a really robust system of funding basic research and clinical trials. And I think we have to have a really robust encouragement system for people to find them and to be able to participate in them. Science is all about the numbers and all about the data, and we need to make sure that when we're running trials, that they don't stop midstream. And when people drop out of trials because of conflicts with payment, as an example, that ruins the science. And we need to make sure that we're kind of building both sides of the demand and signal.
And now, what does this all mean for the future of drug development?
I'm really deeply worried about that exactly. The fact that we're stopping midstream in many cases and devaluing the work that we as a nation have done. And we are the world's leader in developing things like pharmaceutical solutions. And they don't all have to be, drugs or oral or intravenous. There's many other kinds of solutions as well that are helping us to be able to be healthier and to live longer. When we do that, we become a weaker nation, as I mentioned, not just our physical beings, but also us as a national, power. And I think that we are seeing the consequences of that over the last 100 days that I don't know that we can necessarily recover at all or quickly, certainly.
Another at-large question, why is diversity so important when it comes to these clinical trials? I know that's been a barrier and an issue that's been discussed here.
Yeah. So historically, literally, many trials have been conducted with just white men for lots of different reasons. And we don't need to get into that. But the reality is that our nation is not just white men. And we need to your point, have racial diversity, gender diversity to help people with their health issues. Because we all don't react the same way. Our physical beings, our cell composition doesn't react the same way to disease or to the treatment of that disease. And so as a result, we have to have diverse trials, clinical trials, so that when my mom gets sick, she may react differently to something. She actually is diagnosed with Parkinson's than a male would. And in fact, with Parkinson's as being a good example, Parkinson's usually affects men. And so she needs to have that sort of trial that would help people like her. And so this piece of legislation is trying to make sure that we're digging for all of the people who are out there. And sometimes people who are out there don't have the same access to this information as others do, whether trials that are available or not. And they don't have the same time as other people do. And so if we want a diverse base, it incentivizes people, if you are able to pay them, to participate in the trials. But it doesn't incentivize them if by paying them, it ends up penalizing them. And so that's why this bill is so important.
And then, Congresswoman, last question I have. We're running out of time. It's been a fascinating conversation. What gives you hope about this matter right now? You're charging ahead on Capitol Hill. There's conversations happening about this greater problem. What gives you hope about this, that these issues involving clinical trials can be resolved in the near future?
Well, I am usually I usually tell my team the Eeyore to everyone else's Tigger. So I tend to be one of the glass half empty people. And that's why I'm here. I'm here to try to push these kinds of things through. I have hope that something like this has an opportunity, frankly, because of what's happening in terms of pulling down some of the NIH work, because this is a bipartisan bill and because it can be helpful to industry. I am hopeful that this kind of legislation will find the light of day as we look for things that will be bipartisanly supported and help everyone. I sure wish we weren't in this place where where NIH is being undermined and destroyed in the way that it is. But in the meantime, we can affect change with pieces of legislation such as this one. And if it's okay, I'll also mention another piece of legislation similar that is about debt forgiveness or not forgiveness, but a loan deferment for people who are in medical school, specifically dental school, which I also have as a bipartisan piece of legislation. And again, I think it's good time to push these pieces of legislation forward because of the timing right now.
All right, we have to end it there. Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan, a Democrat from Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District. Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And it's now time for our panel. Please welcome Lisa Lacasse, President of American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, Network, and Gary Puckrin. He's the president and CEO of the National Minority Quality Forum. Gary is a prominent advocate for diversity and inclusion in clinical trials, and Lisa would like to see more cancer patients have access to these trials. With that, let's get started. Thank you both for joining us. Lisa, I want to start with you, but Gary, you're going to get a chance to answer this one also. Let's set the scene here. What are some of the biggest barriers to folks getting involved and taking part in these clinical trials?
Yeah, so first, thank you so much. This is such an important topic. I appreciate being here. So I think that there are three major categories of barriers. One is that the clinical trials aren't necessarily happening, at least cancer clinical trials aren't happening where the cancer patients actually are. So it creates a barrier for people to know about the trial and then actually be able to enroll on the trial because it's not close to them geographically. There's, medical challenges and non-medical challenges that create cost barriers. So you may need to drive for a distance. You may need to stay overnight. Those are expenses that maybe people can't afford, and therefore they are disincentivized to enroll on a trial. And that is particularly true for lower income housing households, some socioeconomic households, and then obviously our rural populations that don't have easy access to hospital systems. So it's very multifactorial, but it is, as we know, clinical trials are so important to our ability to reduce disease burden and certainly to reduce the cancer burden nationwide.
Gary, I want to get your take on this also. From your vantage point, what are some of the biggest barriers to participation in these clinical trials?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to talk on this issue. It's absolutely critical. One of the challenges, certainly for diverse populations in terms of participating in clinical trials, is getting asked to participate in the clinical trial. Quite frequently, they're not even invited to participate in clinical trials. And then it depends on the type of trial you're talking about, but not well thought about and talked about is also the fact that in diverse populations, you have a large uninsured population. And so PIs are concerned that if they invite a participant into a clinical trial and they discover some abnormality, how do they follow up with care? So besides the list that Lisa provided, and she's absolutely right on those points, I would add those two. That first of all, we've got to make sure that people get asked, and then the second part of it is that for those who are medically underinsured, how do we take care of them and encourage PIs and sponsors of trials to bring them in?
And Lisa, I cover Congress, so for me, everything always comes back to Capitol Hill. What could Congress do to alleviate some of these issues that you laid out and to sort of increase participation in these clinical trials, given how important they could be?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I'm happy to say that there is a bill that we're hoping will be introduced very soon called the Clinical Trials Modernization Act. Apologies for having to spit out that title. And it really is addressing the barriers that both Gary and I just highlighted, which is allowing trial participants to get some financial support to actually enroll in a clinical trial. We know how important finances are, and so this bill would allow for some direct financial support. It would ensure that direct financial support is not taxable income, which becomes very important. Also, it allows for ensuring that the trials themselves are much more accessible. So elevating the ability for a trial to execute through telemedicine, for example, providing maybe an iPad or some wearable medical devices as part of the trial itself. So it's really addressing the design of the trial and making it easier for enrollment and also reducing the cost barriers. So we are eager for our two representatives, Representative Ruiz and Pfluger, to introduce that bill. And I believe there's another bill that we are waiting on, maybe with a couple of members of Congress that you are going to be talking with, also related to financial support. And so we know cost barriers are very, very critical to people's ability to say, yes, I would like to enroll in a clinical trial if they are asked. And so Congress can make a big difference in lowering barriers to clinical trials with both of these approaches legislatively.
I'm going to have to ask around about this when I'm back in the Capitol. Gary, a similar question for you. What could be done to increase diversity in these clinical trials in terms of who's participating in them?
I think probably the most important thing that I would point out, certain to members of Congress and their staff, that when it comes to healthcare policy and financing, everybody has to follow the science. There is no safe harbor, there's no escape valve. And so clinical trials are incredibly important to add to that, to add to the science, because it is not just for the innovative therapies or devices that help us live long, happy lives, but it also informs clinical guidelines, the practice of medicine. So clinical trials are foundational to everything that we do in healthcare. And we're diverse. Our bodies act differently. And so in order to make sure that we're providing quality care to all Americans, you have to get them into clinical studies. And financial barriers ought not to be an issue here, because if you start with limited access to clinical trials, it means limited information that's going to be needed in order to provide quality care for everyone. So I think members of Congress and their staff have a really important job to do, which is to make sure that our clinical trials are as diverse as possible.
I want to bring.
I'd like to just echo. Can I just echo what Gary is saying? Because our progress in the fight against disease is all about getting actual evidence, and it is so the only way to do that for new standards of care, new guidelines as it relates to maybe screening or prevention is through clinical trials. And so making those clinical trials representative is so important. Right now, the statistic is about 2/3 of clinical trials in the United States have enrollees from other countries. And so we know older Americans, rural Americans, certain racial and ethnic populations are not able to enroll because of the barriers that we've articulated. And therefore, the data that's coming out on the other side of these trials are not representative of who we are as in the United States.
I want to stick with this theme for a second, bring in some current events. We're officially past the 100-day mark of the Trump administration's second term. One of the themes has been this rollback of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, going against DEI. Gary, I'm curious, do these initiatives at all impact diversity and participation for these clinical trials? And if they do, walk us through that. What does that exactly look like?
So to be honest with you, I'm not sure I understand what DEI is, to be really honest. In the world of science, we work with definitions. They're well thought through because what we're trying to get to is predictability. We're trying to understand how to keep populations healthy. And so, we need to be very, very careful with our language and what we're measuring and all of those sorts of things. The point I want to really stress, and it was something that Lisa was saying, in the world of cancer, we are starting to write the last chapter on the war of cancer. If you look at the science and technology that is becoming available to us, it means that we are going to be able to control cancer, certainly over the next 25, 30 years. But in order to do that, we have to have diversity. And so when we get into this language about, it becomes important that we're very, very clear because it's impacting funding, it's impacting the way in which we participate in community. And I think really where our minds need to be set on is that we have the capacity to write the last chapter in the war on cancer. There's nobody in the 20th century that could ever say that. And why we're not paying absolute attention to that and making the investment in it is a question that really needs to be put before all of us. And let's get that job done.
Lisa, I want to bring in a current events question for you as well. Another theme of the first 100 days of the Trump administration has been cutting back on federal spending in a lot of different areas, including investments in some medical research. How has that impacted clinical trials, if at all? And if you can walk us through that.
Yeah, so look, the biomedical research ecosystem is kind of how we say it, is critically important to our ability to learn new things, create new therapies, augment people's understanding of what their risk may be. And so all of that is all part of an ecosystem. And the reduction in federal investment, both at the NIH through the National Cancer Institute, many institutes there, as well as those dollars go into our universities and hospital systems across the country. And also need to highlight the funds that go into the CDC, which support cancer control programs. These are really critical federal investments. They have been investments for decades that have resulted in the United States having the best cancer outcomes, some of the best cancer outcomes in the entire world. And so our very, very heightened concern is that the lack of those federal resources, there are not other parts of the biomedical research ecosystem that can fill those gaps. And so we are extraordinarily concerned with the impact that these reductions will have. And ultimately, many clinical trials, cancer clinical trials, are funded through the NIH and NCI. And so those dollars being significantly reduced will have an impact at the end of the day in the number of clinical trials that are able to be run in the United States, and therefore the number of people who can enroll on those trials. So the very direct impact.
I was doing
I'd like
research.
To, if you don't mind,
yeah, please,
I'd like to, follow up on that DEI question for a second, because it is important. What would anticipate and what we normally see when government is setting standards, you go to the federal registry and there's a definition of terms that have been well thought through. There's a whole committee that comes to work and defines that. We don't see that here. And so what's happening is that each agency is kind of defining DEI, and then outside, everybody is changing their language and behavior in anticipation as if they understand what we mean by DEI. So I think some formalism, if you will, is really important here. That if we're going to use terms like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, then we need to get something in the federal registry that helps us understand precisely what's being done, because funding is being impacted by this, programs are being impacted by this, lives are being impacted by this. So I think clarity is probably really important.
Fascinating. Look, we're running out of time, guys, but there was one more question I really wanted to ask. I was doing research for this conversation, and I read that there are only 5% of Americans actually participate in clinical trials. It just feels like such a small number. So we only have about 2 minutes left, but I want to give you both a chance to respond. What is the driving factor behind that number being so low? And what's the top thing on your list that could expand that number and help it grow? Lisa, we'll start with you.
So for cancer clinical trials specifically, they are just not being offered where that cancer patient actually is. So the vast majority of clinical trials are at phenomenal NCI designated cancer centers, really, really important institutions. But 80% of cancer patients actually get their care in community health settings. They are not in those big academic medical centers. And so we've got to bring the trials to where the patients are, and that will help significantly.
And Gary, I want to get you in on this as well. Just 5% of Americans, such a staggeringly small number.
I agree with Lisa's point. I think we have to bring our trials into community. What we want is our clinical trials to be an option as part of routine care, that your doctor is able to say to you, here's an opportunity that you might want to explore. Right now, we have not taken that infrastructure that Lisa's talking about and driven it right to the community. So we need to build our logistical systems so that we can actually do clinical trials in community, particularly when you're talking in rural community. I know we haven't talked a lot about that. Big time problem in rural communities, and how we make sure that folks who live in rural communities also have access to clinical trials.
Yeah, so clinical trial design and cost barriers are probably the most important interventions that would increase enrollment.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Fascinating conversation. Lisa Lacasse, Gary Puckrin, thank you both so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we've reached the end of the program. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers for taking part in the conversation. On behalf of The Hill and our sponsor, Eli Lilly, thank you all to you for taking part in the conversation and joining us. Now, if you missed parts of the event, don't worry. They're going to be available online on our website and on our social media platforms. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.